June 12, 1942. Late at night on the Eastern Front. German soldiers along the front lines braced themselves for another air raid. By now, they knew the routine. Soviet bombers usually announced their arrival with the distant growl of engines long before the first bombs fell. The warning was rarely welcome, but it was familiar. This time was different. Out of the darkness came a sound no one could quite identify. Not engines, not propellers, just a faint, eerie whisper. Like wind sliding through stretched canvas. At first, many soldiers froze, unsure of what they were hearing. Searchlights snapped on and began sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft crews rushed to their guns, scanning desperately for targets. The strange sound grew louder, drifting lower over the German positions. Then the night exploded. Fuel depots erupted into towering fireballs. Ammunition dumps detonated in rapid succession. Secondary blasts rippled across the landscape, lighting the horizon in flashes of orange and white. Chaos spread through the German lines as officers shouted orders and gunners fired blindly into the darkness. And then caught briefly. In the harsh glare of the searchlights, the attackers finally revealed themselves. They were not the fast, modern bombers the Germans expected. They were tiny, slow, fragile-looking biplanes, barely more than wood and fabric, gliding silently through the night sky. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. These aircraft were not flown by elite male pilots. Every single one of them was flown by women. Within months, German troops would give these mysterious night raiders a name whispered with equal parts fear and frustration across the Eastern Front: the Night Witches. By late 1941, the Soviet Union was in crisis. After the launch of Operation Barbarossa, German forces had smashed deep into Soviet territory with shocking speed. Entire armies had been encircled. Airfields were overrun. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the opening weeks alone. The Red Air Force was not just losing planes, it was losing trained pilots faster than new ones could be prepared. The situation was becoming desperate. Factories were relocating east. Cities were under threat. And the Soviet High Command needed manpower wherever it could find it. Amid this chaos, one woman saw an opportunity hidden inside the disaster. Marina Raskova was already a national hero, a record-setting aviator often compared to Amelia Earhart. But in 1941, her role shifted from record breaker to recruiter. For months, Raskova had been flooded with letters from young Soviet women. Students, factory workers, and aviation club members all asked the same question: let us fight. They didn't want support roles. They didn't want to stay behind the lines. They wanted combat. Raskova understood both the political moment and the military need. She compiled the requests and took an unprecedented proposal directly to the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. Her argument was simple but compelling. The country needed pilots, and thousands of motivated, partially trained women were volunteering. In October 1941, Stalin made a decision that stunned many within the Soviet military establishment. He approved the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments: fighters, dive bombers, and night bombers. It was an extraordinary gamble born from wartime necessity. From more than 2,000 applicants, roughly 400 women were selected and rushed into an accelerated training program. What normally took years would now be compressed into months. The pressure was immense, and the expectations were even higher. Among the new units formed was one that few initially took seriously: a small night harassment group that would soon make history, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Within a year, German soldiers across the Eastern Front would learn to fear the sound of their approach. When the women of the 588th reported for duty, they did not receive sleek modern bombers or heavily armed fighters. Instead, they were issued an aircraft many Soviet commanders themselves considered outdated, the Polikarpov Po-2. At first glance, it hardly looked like a combat aircraft at all. It was slow. It was fragile. And it was built mostly from wood and canvas stretched over a lightweight frame, originally designed in the late 1920s as a training and utility plane. The Po-2 had never been intended to face modern air defenses. Its open cockpit exposed crews directly to the freezing air. It carried no armor. Early versions didn't even have radios. Its performance figures were equally unimpressive. Top speed, about 94 miles per hour. Bomb load, typically just 2 small bombs on paper. The aircraft appeared hopelessly obsolete for the brutal air war raging over the Eastern Front. Many German pilots initially dismissed it as little more than a nuisance, but war has a way of turning weaknesses into unexpected advantages. The Po-2's extremely low speed created a strange tactical problem for German interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190. These high-performance fighters were designed for speed and power. When they attempted to slow down enough to track the lumbering biplanes at low altitude, they risked stalling in several encounters. German pilots overshot their targets or struggled to maintain firing position. Even more important was the Po-2's construction. Because much of the aircraft was made from wood and fabric rather than metal, it produced a weaker return on German radar systems of the time. Combined with low-altitude night flying, this made detection significantly harder, and then there was the darkness at night. With engines throttled back or cut entirely during the final approach, the little biplane could become almost ghost-like in the sky. Slow. Yes, vulnerable, absolutely. But in the hands of determined crews flying under cover of darkness, the humble Po-2 was about to become one of the most psychologically effective harassment weapons of the entire war. The Night Witches did not rely on speed, armor, or heavy bomb loads. Instead, they built their reputation on something far more powerful: smart, disciplined tactics over months of combat. The women of the 588th refined a method that was simple in design and terrifyingly effective in execution. Each mission followed a deadly, almost ritual rhythm. First, the crews would take off after sunset, when darkness gave them their greatest advantage. Flying at extremely low altitude, they navigated toward German positions using little more than maps, compasses, and memorized landmarks. As they approached the target area, the pilot would perform the maneuver that made them legendary. The engine was cut. Suddenly, the steady drone of the aircraft vanished. The little Polikarpov Po-2 became a glider, slipping quietly through the night air. With no engine noise to warn defenders, the aircraft drifted forward in near silence. What German soldiers heard in those final moments became infamous across the Eastern Front: a soft, eerie whoosh, the sound of wind rushing through canvas wings and wooden struts. Then came the explosions. Bombs were released at close range, maximizing accuracy before the pilot restarted the engine and escaped back into the darkness. To make matters worse for German defenders, the Night Witches rarely attacked alone. Their standard formation used 3 aircraft working together in a carefully coordinated pattern. 2 planes would deliberately expose themselves first, flying visibly enough to attract searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. German gunners, believing they had located the threat, would concentrate their attention on these bait aircraft. That was exactly the trap. While defenses were focused elsewhere, the third Po-2 would approach silently with its engine off, gliding unseen toward the target. By the time German crews realized another aircraft was overhead, the bombs were already falling. Then the formation would rotate roles and strike again, this relentless pattern of deception. Noise, silence, and sudden destruction created a psychological effect far greater than the small bombs alone could achieve, and it turned the Night Witches into one of the most unnerving threats on the Eastern Front. For the women of the 588th, the enemy was not just German flak and fighters. It was the cold. The Polikarpov Po-2 had an open cockpit, offering virtually no protection from the elements. In the brutal winters of the Eastern Front, temperatures routinely plunged far below freezing. At altitude, the wind cut through layers of clothing like knives. Frostbite was not a rare risk, it was an expected hazard. Veteran pilot Nadezhda Popova later described the experience in stark terms. Simply leaning over the cockpit edge to improve visibility could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Faces went numb. Fingers stiffened on the controls. Boots sometimes froze so solid that crews struggled to move after landing. And the cold was only part of the problem. Equipment shortages plagued the regiment from the beginning. These women were issued standard men's uniforms, often far too large to fit properly. Heavy boots slipped on the rudder pedals, forcing crews to stuff them with rags or newspaper just to maintain control. Navigation tools were basic, usually just maps, compasses, and stopwatches. Sometimes they didn't even carry parachutes. The reasoning was brutally practical. Parachutes added weight, and weight meant fewer bombs. At the low altitudes they typically flew, many crews believed a parachute wouldn't save them anyway. If the aircraft caught fire, survival odds were slim. So they flew without them, night after night. Mission after mission. It was not unusual for a single crew to complete 8, 10, even 18 sorties in one night. Each run meant another takeoff in darkness, another freezing flight through flak-filled skies, another silent glide toward enemy positions. Sleep came in brief, exhausted fragments between missions. When it came at all, the danger never truly faded, but neither did the attacks. Through exhaustion, cold, and constant risk, the night witches kept returning to the sky again and again until German troops learned there would be no quiet nights on the Eastern Front. German troops did not take long to give the mysterious night raiders a name, Nachwechseln, the night witches. It began as dark trench humor, but the nickname quickly spread through units across the Eastern Front to exhausted German soldiers. The whispering approach of the small biplanes felt almost supernatural. The attackers appeared out of darkness, struck with little warning, and vanished before effective retaliation could begin. What made the night witches so effective was not the size of their bombs, it was the psychological pressure they created. Their raids rarely wiped out entire divisions. That was never the mission. Instead, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment specialized in something far more insidious, relentless night harassment, night after night, sometimes for weeks on end. German positions would be disturbed again and again by the now familiar pattern. First the distant drone, then the sudden silence, then the soft whoosh overhead, then explosions. The results accumulated quickly. German troops were denied sleep, often forced to dive for cover multiple times per night. Units that might otherwise have rested between daytime operations remained on constant alert. Anti-aircraft crews stayed tense and fatigued. Searchlight operators scanned the skies for hours without relief. Even when physical damage was limited, the mental toll was severe. The night witches also targeted supply points with precision. Fuel dumps, ammunition stores, rail junctions, and artillery positions were frequent objectives. Small bombs, dropped repeatedly over time, disrupted logistics and forced German commanders to divert resources to air defense far behind the front lines. Morale suffered accordingly. Reports from German units frequently mentioned exhaustion, frustration, and the unnerving unpredictability of the attacks. Soldiers could never be sure when the next raid would begin, only that it would probably come after midnight. When fatigue was already at its worst, the German High Command took the threat seriously. In an unusual move, Luftwaffe leadership authorized Iron Cross incentives for fighter pilots who successfully shot down one of the slow-moving biplanes. Normally, the decoration was reserved for acts of significant combat achievement. Offering it for the destruction of such lightly armed aircraft was a clear sign of how disruptive the night witches had become. Interceptions did occur, and losses were real. The wood and canvas Polikarpov Po-2 was extremely vulnerable if caught in searchlights or struck by tracer fire. But the combination of low altitude, darkness, and clever tactics made successful engagements far more difficult than German planners had expected. Meanwhile, the women kept flying through 1942. 1943 and into the final Soviet offensives of the war, the regiment maintained a punishing operational tempo. Crews often flew multiple sorties per night, returning again and again until dawn approached. By war's end, the unit had flown roughly 24,000 combat sorties. an extraordinary number for any air regiment, let alone one flying such limited aircraft. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs and tens of thousands of incendiaries across German positions. Their persistence did not go unnoticed in Moscow. In 1943, the regiment was awarded Elite Guard status for its combat performance and redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. The honor marked them as one of the Soviet Air Force's most reliable and effective units. Individual recognition followed. More than 20 of its members would eventually receive the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest military decoration. What had begun as a desperate wartime experiment, hastily trained women flying obsolete aircraft, had evolved into one of the most psychologically effective harassment forces of the entire war. By 1945, one thing was certain across the Eastern Front: when darkness fell, the Night Witches were never far behind. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the women of the Night Witches had been flying combat missions for nearly 3 relentless years, from their first tentative raids in 1942 to the final Soviet offensives over Eastern Europe and Germany. The regiment had maintained one of the most demanding operational tempos of any air unit in the war. Night after night, in every season and in brutal conditions, they had climbed into their fragile aircraft and gone back into the darkness. By the end, their record was extraordinary. The former 588th Night Bomber Regiment, redesignated in 1943 as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, had flown roughly 24,000 combat sorties. They had dropped thousands of tons of bombs and tens of thousands of incendiary devices. More than 20 of their pilots and navigators had been awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. On paper, it was the kind of record that might have guaranteed lasting fame, but peace brought an unexpected and quieter reality. In October 1945, just months after victory in Europe, the regiment was officially disbanded. The decision was administrative and political rather than operational. With the war over, the Soviet military rapidly downsized its wartime formations. At the same time, the leadership began steering society back toward more traditional gender roles. During the desperate years of invasion and survival, women in combat had been a necessity. In peacetime, that necessity faded for many of the Night Witches. The transition was abrupt and deeply personal. After years of high-risk combat flying, they were suddenly expected to return to ordinary civilian lives. Some managed to remain connected to aviation in small ways, working in civil aviation, training programs, or technical roles. But many found the doors to professional flying careers quietly closing. Their wartime experience did not always translate into peacetime opportunity. Public recognition followed a similar pattern. Within the Soviet Union, the Night Witches were respected, and their honors were real. Yet their story did not receive the same sustained spotlight often given to famous male fighter aces or large bomber formations. Over time, their achievements became part of specialist military history rather than broad popular memory. Still, the women themselves did not disappear. Veterans maintained contact with one another, attending reunions and preserving their shared history. Memoirs were written. Interviews were recorded. Gradually, historians, first in the Soviet Union and later in the West, began to take deeper interest in the regiment's unique combat record. By the late 20th century, the Night Witches were finally gaining wider international recognition. Books, documentaries, and academic studies brought their story to new audiences. Meetings between former Night Witches and American Women Air Force service pilots WSPs symbolized a broader appreciation of women's roles in wartime aviation. What emerged from these efforts was a clearer understanding of what the regiment had accomplished. They had not possessed the fastest aircraft. They had not carried the heaviest bomb loads. They had not enjoyed the best equipment. What they did have was discipline, adaptability, and extraordinary persistence, flying the humble Polikarpov Po-2. They turned limitations into tactical advantages. They mastered night navigation with minimal instruments. They endured freezing cockpits, constant fatigue, and the ever-present risk of fire or interception. And they return to the sky again and again, sometimes 18 times in a single night. Today, the legacy of the night witches stands far beyond the statistics of sorties and bomb tonnage. They demonstrated that innovation can offset technological disadvantage. They proved that psychological pressure can be as powerful as raw firepower. And perhaps most importantly, they showed that courage and skill know no gender. What began in 1941 as a desperate wartime gamble had become one of the most remarkable aviation stories of the Second World War. Long after the wooden biplanes stopped flying and the searchlights went dark, the memory of that soft whooshing sound in the night continued to echo through military history, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely force can become the most unforgettable. If you enjoyed this story of the Night Witches, make sure to subscribe for more untold military history that most documentaries miss, and tell me in the comments which World War II unit should we cover next, because history is full of incredible stories. And we're just getting started.